For months, we've been faced with an escalation of two military actions that could lead to nuclear war. It's being fueled by deliberate provocations. You have the NATO proxy war against Russia in Ukraine with Team Biden and the unelected bureaucrats and NATO hawks running the escalations there. And then you have the radical Zionists running Israel, using an attack by Hamas as a justification for a murderous assault on the non-Israeli population of Palestine, in what can legitimately be described minimally as ethnic cleansing, or less politely as genocide. Now, we're seeing a lot of smoke and mirrors coming from some of the commentators, especially those, as Dennis mentioned, from the so-called realist school, or people who believe in the balance of power. The people who are saying that, well, you have to recognize that Putin made a mistake by going into Ukraine, that Muslim terrorists did provoke the reaction of Israel. This is ahistorical. It throws out history, and they're literally false interpretations. But most importantly, if you approach the world from that standpoint, there's no strategy for peace. The best you can get would be a temporary ceasefire, because they're missing the real picture. And the real picture, if you cut through the narrative and the lies, the real picture is that we're at the end of a 500 to 600 year period of history, which is a period of European colonialism. And the potential for a new paradigm comes from those forces that are self-consciously breaking from that. The leadership in the global South, the emergence of leaders in Africa and Asia, the BRICS Plus. And when you see this kind of emergence of a new character in the battle, you then have to go back and say, well, who are they fighting? And who's fighting against them? And that's why we have to start with LaRouche and LaRouche's idea that empires are primarily about economics. You know, he wrote a very interesting piece in 2003. It's a short one. It's called How Liberalism Created Fascism. And I'm going to draw on the general idea he presented in that, where he talks about how the key to an empire is there's an oligarchy that's asserting what they think are their rights, whether it's a divine right, as in the case of monarchs, or merit due to their alleged inherent superiority. And this is where eugenics and racism comes in. At the same time, it's this oligarchy that is making the rules, whether you call it a rules-based order or just a top-down empire. It's an oligarchy, a small group of people with vested private interests. And that's what the present empire is. It's not exactly a US empire, because most people in the United States oppose the idea. Anglo-American might be better if you're talking about London and Wall Street, or transatlantic. But what we're looking at, as LaRouche identified in this paper on How Liberalism Created Fascism, is you have to look at the Anglo-Dutch liberal model, where, in a sense, the state or government has no sovereign power. The power is in the hands of the oligarchy, which uses the state as a tool, which is what the corporate cartels of the military-industrial financial complex are doing today. Now, there's a useful quote, and we'll get into this character in a few minutes, Thomas Hobbes, but he had an actual insight into this, not an intentional insight, because he was part of the problem. But he said, it is not wisdom, but authority that makes a law. It's an expression of might makes right. And that's the basis of the power asserted by an imperial oligarchy. So if you go back to look at the Venetian model and then trace that through the Anglo-Dutch, what you see is that you have the existence of a ruling oligarchy, usually in families. Secondly, a belief in wealth in monetary terms. That is, they don't, or they generally feel threatened by technological progress, because technological progress leads to population growth. And the oligarchy is hostile to the idea of a growing population. And depopulation, in fact, is one of their intentions. Now, when I say belief in wealth in monetary terms, it's the idea that money itself is wealth. And therefore, any process which gives you more money is legitimate, whether it's usury, looting, slavery. These are uh, products of an imperial system to gain increasing wealth of those who run the empire. And to do it, of course, you have to have militarization. You have to have a military of some force. But what the British in particular learned, and the Venetians also, is get others to do the fighting, the divide and conquer. And that's what geopolitics is. Geopolitics is not a science. It's not based on a study of how populations advance or decline. It's about how you can divide countries up and carry out a policy that will allow the imperial looting to continue. So when you look at the starting of this in the modern period, it's the 13th century to about the 15th century of Venice. And Venice extending its empire toward the east, toward Africa, toward Northern Europe. And in particular, it was around the Dutch East Indies Company, which was founded in 1600, about the same time as the British East India Company, which is not a coincidence. And both of these companies were involved extensively as trading companies, but trading to them meant the ability to loot and use whatever force you can to get the job done, which included slavery. Now, let me just go through a couple of aspects of this to give you a little bit of a picture. Let me have the first slide, please, Kynan. This was the Venetian Empire in, what is that, 1500 or so? Yeah. And you see, it's not exactly a good place to run an empire from. The Venetian Empire was a maritime empire. It included using the trade routes of the old Silk Road, but it was not situated effectively to conduct a global imperial policy. Now, in Venice, the power was in the handful of families who selected a doge, and there was a council of elders who ran the country. Now, one interesting insight we have, Dennis already mentioned this, in looking at Venice, is the work of Shakespeare. And Othello is one example, how you can essentially use psychological warfare to manipulate your opponents. Also, The Merchant of Venice. What's the topic there? It's usury, but more importantly, the mistreatment of people in order to continue the process of usury. Now, why was this important in Britain in Shakespeare's time? Well, because it was at that period of time that the Venetian model was moving north, especially into Holland, and then from there into London. Let me have the next slide, please. One of the crucial people to study in looking at this is Thomas Hobbes. And people have some ideas about him, that his idea of the Leviathan, that you have to have a power in the state to control people. You know, there are all kinds of quotes from him, but probably the most important is that society is a battle of each against all. Hobbes was typical of the generations that followed him, who essentially believed that human beings are animals, that only a handful of people have creative potential, and that those people should use their creativity to keep the mobs under control. And that since life is brutal and short, you can gain control by providing certain little goodies, going back to the idea of the Roman circuses. But essentially, Hobbes was a defender of usury and a defender of a state in which power was used to keep the animals under control. And Hobbes was born in 1588 and he died in 1679. So he lived throughout the period of the Dutch involvement with London and eventually takeover of London. Let me have the next one, please. This is William of Orange, who became King William III. He was the Dutch king who was involved in what was called the Glorious Revolution in 1688. Essentially, by the time he came in, you had an attack, a thorough attack, on what had grown up as a positive development in Shakespeare's time. That is the emergence of the nation state. And this is crucial from understanding LaRouche's assessment of how empires work and what their job is. Because you had in the 15th century the emergence of the idea of the nation state as a sovereign entity that had one purpose, which was to act in the interests of its population and to, as much as possible, have that population be involved in making the policy to define what was in their interests. This occurred simultaneously with the advance of the Renaissance and the development of the first nation state of Louis XI in France, and then Henry Tudor, Henry VII in England. And the idea of the nation state, to the extent they practiced it, was to avoid war, to figure out means of increasing trade and production. And this was a fundamental breakthrough in human history, where the purpose of the state was not to increase the wealth of the ruling oligarchs, but to address the general welfare or the common good. Hobbes argued there's no such thing as a common good, that in fact, since everybody has different tastes and desires, it's best to let them each seek the fulfillment of their tastes and desires, even if it means a clash with everyone else, as opposed to the idea that came from Cusa and then was carried out through Louis XI and the Tudor Renaissance, which was the beginnings of an understanding of how trade and economic policy can increase the power of labor to increase overall the bounty of nature that man can partake of. And in particular, that it was up to man to increase that bounty, to use science to do so. That's what William of Orange was deployed to stop. That's what the Glorious Revolution was about. It had been going on for a while. You had the whole 17th century in England was a battle between the remnants of the Tudor policy and the emergence of the Stuarts, the Scottish aristocracy working with the French, and so on. But what came out of it was a consolidation of the imperial faction in England. And two of the more important people in that are in the next slide. Parson Malthus and Adam Smith. Now, Adam Smith was born in 1723 and lived to 1790 during the period of the American Revolution. And it's very clear that his seminal work, The Wealth of Nations, was an attack on the ideas of Benjamin Franklin, who had carried with him the ideas of Leibniz. And Leibniz as a scientist, as a philosopher, who believed in the inherent goodness of man and the capability of man to improve the society, was a direct contrast with Hobbes and John Locke and others. And Smith's Wealth of Nations argues that essentially only through completely free market policies can you have an economic system that works. Now, there's a lot of back and forth on this because I've been reading some of the papers put out recently by the Adam Smith Foundation, I think it's called, and they're a little backtracking now because they're saying, well, we do want globalization, we do want no tariffs, we do want the ability to have an international trading system, but that hasn't worked so well, so we have to do some work on it. But essentially, what Smith was attacking was Franklin's idea that was later realized through the Federalist Papers and then the discussions around the Constitutional Convention of the United States, the founding of the United States, that government does play a role and must play a role. And this is going to be one of the key issues in dealing with the whole economic mess that Biden has left in the hands of Donald Trump, because there's a lot of back and forth over whether government is the problem. And if you understand what Smith represented, and I'll get to Malthus in a second, their view is that government is the problem. But the question is, who's running the government? Hobbes obviously said that the government should be in the hands of the aristocrats. This is the Venetian model. But the founding fathers said it should be determined through real representative government, in which the people, through debate, through working through the whole questions of the future, make the determinations of what actually is in the general welfare for the majority of the population and how to achieve that. So Malthus is an important figure because he put forward the argument for reducing population. His population theory was that population grows geometrically, food production arithmetically. Therefore, the population will constantly outstrip the capability of nature to provide for man. Now, of course, we hear this all the time. This is at the core of the green argument, that people are the problem, that the use of resources are the problem. There's a limited resource available. Well, LaRouche attacked that constantly. And he said that the solution to that is human creativity. Because if you just take any resource and don't change over time, you're eventually going to use it up. And the question is, how do you intervene in nature to find new ways of producing or providing what you need for energy and power, for producing food, and so on? But Malthus argued the opposite, that there's no way to do that. And this is important because the British monarchy and the British East India Company in particular was committed to wiping out populations, whether it was in Ireland, whether it was in India, in some of the African colonies, to just have enough people who could do the work of getting the raw materials and bringing them to the ports to be shipped to the imperial power. And so at the heart of the imperial system is this idea that human beings have limitations, and that those limitations require us to periodically cull the herd, as it was put by others more recently. Now, let's have the next slide, please. This shows the British Empire in 1815. Now, most people think the peak of the British Empire was in the 18th century, when, of course, North America was part of the British Empire. But as you can see here, it was much less limited than that. It was not that huge, but let me have the next one. The next slide, please. This is the British Empire in the 1920s. And you can see the expansion and the continued attempt to control the global South as a source of resources and cheap labor. And that's what the British Empire was about. Now, one of the points LaRouche made repeatedly is the British Empire was not something from the 18th or 19th century, but has continued into the present. It's evolved, it's changed, but it's the principles that I identified of usury, of depopulation, of racism, have been the stable core. And what's been added after 1900 was a theory of geopolitics, an ideology of how to control the world population and how to control the nations. But the key to it is no sovereignty, that nations have no right to act on behalf of the general welfare of their population. Now, does this empire still exist today? Well, let me have the next slide, please. There's King Charles. This is his official portrait, which tells you a little bit about his taste in art and his self-identity. But if you saw him at his coronation wearing a crown that was too big and a uniform dating back to somewhere in the 18th century, you realize that these rites and rituals still exist and are used in a sense to separate the elite, as they see themselves, from the hoi polloi, the general population. Let me have the next one, please. Almost as powerful as King Charles himself, although Charles is the peer of all peers, is the Lord Mayor of the City of London, seen here in his carriage. When Charles was coronated, after the official government coronation, he had to go to the City of London for a ceremony where they accepted him as the king. The City of London is a sovereign area inside the actual town of London and the country of Britain. But its tentacles reach all over the world through its control over banking. And it's the City of London which also is totally integrated with MI6, and MI6 and British intelligence and the Five Eyes have an enormous influence on what's being discussed in the United States, what the policies in the United States are, through something called the Five Eyes. And it's from the supporters of the special relationship that you hear the most blatant, vicious comments against Tulsi Gabbard and Kash Patel in particular, and against Trump, because the City of London, during the first Trump administration, the Lords of the House of Lords issued a paper saying that if Trump were to be reelected, that is, if he would have been reelected in 2020, it would have ended the special relationship. And their goal is to use the special relationship to keep the United States as a powerful force defending the imperial interests of the City of London and British corporate cartels. Now, among the control handles of control they have are the neocons in the United States. Let me have the next slide, please. This was a book that we put out on the Cheney-Bush administration. You can see there Wolfowitz, Ashcroft, who was Attorney General, and Donald Rumsfeld. The gall of these people to say that you can't trust someone like Tulsi Gabbard when their administration was nothing but lies, when the people in the intelligence community ran the Russiagate story, they ran the Hunter Biden laptop story, they have the whole narrative that Putin's special military operation was unprovoked. And they say that we have to be careful because Tulsi Gabbard is susceptible to conspiracy theory. Well, the 51 intelligence officers who wrote the letter saying that the Hunter Biden laptop was a classic case of Russian disinformation, what about them? I don't want to say that was a conspiracy, but the word leaked out that it was Tony Blinken, now Biden's outgoing Secretary of State. It was Blinken who organized one of the former CIA directors to draft the letter to disrupt the Trump campaign in 2020. So we're preparing a dossier on this whole question of the liars who are trying to stop and disrupt the potential of Trump to go after this permanent bureaucracy. Now, who else is part of this permanent bureaucracy? Let me have the next one, please. Well, here we see George Soros and Bill Gates. Wealthy people, Soros, a speculator, Gates, probably the largest landowner in the world right now. He's runs his own feudal empire. And these are people who are making policy behind the scenes. Soros especially is involved in the regime change coups and color revolutions in the Eastern Europe and Russia. Gates has an enormous position in terms of land and wealth in Africa. And these are people who are committed to the idea of a great reset that takes power away from governments, exactly as Hobbes said. Hobbes said that government should be instruments of the aristocracy. Well, that's what we see today. And let me have the next one. There you have on the left the coat of arms of the British East India Company. On the right, BlackRock. BlackRock is one of these companies that's handling, I think it's $11 trillion of wealth. They're using it in such things as buying up the farmland of Ukraine through a special relationship with Zelensky. These are the oligarchs. These are the ones who believe in the policies of usury, speculation, who are committed to depopulation, and they operate from the standpoint, as Hobbes did, that man is not good. You cannot trust people to make the right decisions, so you have to control the information that gets to them, censorship, so-called fact-checking, and so on. Now, it's these people that created the ideology of geopolitics. The geopolitics doesn't exist, as I said, as some kind of scientific investigation of how countries should relate, but is designed to protect the empire and particularly defend the empire's looting rights. Now, again, it's based on the idea that man is inherently evil and can be bought off or manipulated. And let me have the last slide, please. This is countered in the 10 principles of Helga Zepp-LaRouche that are the basis of a new paradigm. And the first paragraph here is, to me, the essence of this, where she says the basic assumption for the new paradigm is that man is fundamentally good and capable to infinitely perfect the creativity of his mind and the beauty of his soul, and being the most advanced geological force in the universe, which proves that the lawfulness of the mind and that of the physical universe are in correspondence and cohesion, and that all evil is the result of a lack of development and therefore can be overcome. To do that is the role of the nation state. A nation state as a sovereign entity in which its people make the determination through representative government. And that's what's been under attack since the time of the American Revolution, when the American Revolution was the anti-colonial fight of our founding fathers to create the kind of world in which people can be fundamentally good. And so I think when you hear the discussion about how to end wars and how to reach agreements and negotiate treaties and so on, if it doesn't start from this principle that's in Helga's 10 principles of the inherent goodness of man, it's not going to work. And that's why Lyndon LaRouche stands as such an example in saying that empires are about economics, and economics are not about money, but about the extending the creative reach of man into the universe.